Okay, I think we have everyone back. Maybe still eating, but everyone back. So a quick notes regarding this afternoon. After the break and the last session on Group 6 of questions, Richard will do the wrap-up of today's discussion and identify the various items which are on the agenda for the wrap-up. Also regarding our observators, mainly our students, I just want to mention, actually we have an assignment for you. No, seriously, if you want to comment, if you want to add your own voice to what we are discussing, or even discuss items which were mentioned this morning, feel free to do. I think you have a microphone somewhere there for you, so we would be interested also in having your point of view as people who are learning the standard, I assume, and who are going to work eventually in the field and having to write descriptions. So please feel free to add your own voice at any time if you want. Okay, so group four of questions were about governance of the standard. And this section included 2 questions. First one said that CCAD currently maintains RAD, as everybody knows, within an archival network pressed for resources. We're still pressed for resources? All right. Yes, we are, right? Okay, just want to make sure. What organizational structure will best ensure the standard the standard can be maintained sustainably? And the majority of answers went to CCAD, so 34% of individuals, 50% in groups said that CCA and CCAD should stay in charge of maintaining RAD or whatever standard we adopt. And after that, we have either the ICA or Professional National Committee institutional basis not specified, 14% each. So these were the other identified. The professional associations, ACA and AAQ, didn't really score high on this. The other question, what are the costs associated with maintaining a standard and what models exist for ensuring sustainability? For example, RDA is subscription-based. The ICA standards are freely available online, and DAX is available for sale in hardcover and for free in PDF. So what do we see regarding that for our future standard? So the questions are there? Anyone wants to start a discussion?
Well, I would say that we keep it with the CCA, CCAD, and also it will have representation from. I would ensure that it has, and it already would have representation from ACA and AAQ as well. And in terms of the cost, free I think is the way to go because we're Canadian and we don't have that much money.
Yes, we're Canadian, and we will have to have a French version of the standard also, and that's actually an expensive proposition. I don't know if you're going to find a translator willing to do an entire translation for free.
And if I can add, it's not just the cost of translation as well, it's the cost associated with the maintenance of the standard. There's communication, there's teleconferences, there's face-to-face meetings that we used to hold that were quite effective. Perhaps that can now be done virtually. but there are costs to maintaining, and collectively we have to figure out how that's going to happen, because there's no revenue stream associated with maintenance of a standard. And any costs associated with implementing is a barrier to implementation as well. So this is a mystery that we have to solve.
I guess my follow-up question would be, what kind of cost would you anticipate then having to charge? That would come into it. Like, would it be $10,000? Would it be $10? That sort of thing. So if there was a cost, and would it be based on who's buying it? If it was a student, would you give them a certain rate versus an institution?
Or hearkening back to Heather's point earlier about the origins of RAD being with the Bureau and with the archival associations, ACU and ACA, would there be an opportunity to discuss between ACA, ACU, and CCA on splitting the cost, keeping in mind that that would be a benefit both to institutions but also to individual archivists, so as to keep the cost for individual archivists at a free or nominal?
Well, the cost associated with development of RAD was publicly funded originally. It wasn't actually paid for by the professional associations. It came through CCA, what we knew was the regular program. And it was several $1 million that were associated with the development and implementation of RAD. Changes, we would hope, would not be as expensive, but perhaps it's not a matter, as Lisa said, of charging for implementation or for tools associated with the use of RAD or whatever standard we have. Maybe it's an upfront cost. How do we fundraise to support the development and ongoing maintenance on a yearly basis, which on a yearly basis might only be $30,000. It's not insurmountable, but it is something that we have to have a revenue stream from. We have to be able to know that that money is going to be there for ongoing development.
Unlike many archives in the country, does CCA actually qualify for the funding program?
I think my concern would be if we did charge, just because so many of the alternatives are kind of freely available to people, that you could see people just using what came to hand. So it would be a danger of the not getting sort of buy-in would be one issue.
And as Heather had said previously as well, the implementation, people had to actually use RAD in order to receive grants or contributions in the past. We don't have that carrot anymore. So how are we going to help institutions come on board with any new standard? All part of the governance question.
I mean, as much as I think that these questions are important and that we do need a solution, I agree that as soon as you put like a hard pay barrier on it, then you risk having no one implement it. When it comes to digital preservation, how many people have paid for the ISO version of the OIS reference model? Probably no one, right? We all go get it from the free source that's available from which the ISO standard was derived, because that's what we have to do. I do wonder if there might be opportunities to leverage some existing resources, like if membership fees associated with like either membership in the ACA or the CCA might reflect a small increase that helps go to funding the maintenance activities or something like that, so the cost is distributed that way, and nobody's suddenly having to like fork $100 over just to get the standard, but maybe once a year they're paying $5 more for their membership costs or something like that. That's one possibility. Another possibility might be that some of the additional tools that have been discussed might incur some costs, and that can help fund the maintenance of just the general standard, which would be freely available. So maybe there's like a transformation script that will take a RAD description and help transform it into like the updated RAD version or something like that. And that's something that might have a cost for institutions to access or something. I think that we should try to think creatively about how to keep it as freely available as possible while still addressing these concerns.
On the other hand, we could mix the carrot with the stick, that we could license the integration of the standard into database systems so that our vendors are paying for the opportunity to implement the standards in their systems. And then it would be freely available to users. And indirectly, the stick would be that users would not have a database available that would reference a previous standard.
I
I should have asked you to close your ears before I said that.
I don't know if that's it's an interesting idea actually, but I think any barrier, any cost barrier, is going to be a deterrent. So free works. I think that part of the question is really how do we reduce costs of maintenance, and we've talked about print versions. Well, print costs a lot of money, especially hardcover bound version. So I don't think that should be in our. I don't know why we would want to do that when we can, have an electronic resource with a style sheet that allows people to print it as an EPUB or as a PDF or whatever format they need. Even the idea of making a cost on the style sheet, they're going to be institutions that will just go make their own, and then there will be a prevalence of free style sheets that do the same thing. And so you would put a lot of money into kind of developing something, assuming that there's a revenue stream that actually I think would be pretty small. So free is really where I think we need to be looking for anywhere possible and reducing costs to allow us to do that. This is something that should be publicly funded. How that happens is really, where do we ask for the money? Is it through the new sort of LAC program? Is it directly from LAC? I don't know, but I think that if we're talking about a real national standard, it should be a publicly funded thing to provide to the community for free.
Maybe it's also a false problem, I don't know, but if you want the standard apply, you have to think about educational mean, because it's in the formation where the first place where the people will learn the standard. And if you have a cost issue, just for instance, the ISO, we have a huge problems to make them available because it costs fortune, and our institution cannot pay for that. So whatever the solutions which will be taken, we have to keep in mind that it should be easy for students to get the standard and an updated, because if they have to pay off every time the standards are, and I presume that in the digital era we had to update a lot of the standard over the time. So that's an issue. Educational, how you can make them available for a reasonable cost.
Just in terms of the idea of licensing it and then making vendors pay for it, I would question how that would work for open source software, for example. That could just prevent the standard from being implemented in open source software. Or in Artifactual's case, where we are driven by the bounty model of development, really that means to implement it, we would have to pass on those costs to community users who could afford to pay for it. So it's just another way of passing the buck on to the users.
I think in terms of fundraising, we have lots of models out there in the community and in other industries that provide the roadmap for how we would implement ways for funding to be funneled from various levels. And I would just advocate for the opportunity for stuff to come directly from the grassroots. So we have that idea of creating some kind of foundation for a continuing revenue, but also the opportunity for, I don't know, like a PayPal account or the kinds of little fundraisings that we do that we could just throw it into the pot and contribute to the wider effort.
Suggesting a Kickstarter to revise RAD?
I'm suggesting something like really, really, really basic, where it's right at the grassroots, where you have a PayPal account and you can just literally throw in $25, or at ACA or AAQ, when like stuff like the silent auction is incredibly successful, and we've had success in those areas. So I would advocate that ideally you want all the money be coming down. It's useful to have a representation of community support from the bottom as well.
I think in terms of like the dollar figure you kind of mentioned there, Chris, about for developing RAD the first time, like if we were trying to raise that, like there's no way we could come up with it, right? Because like we would need to get some sort of public funding. So the development might be one cost and the maintenance might be another in terms of models. But I can't see how we could like come up with $2 million based on, you know, the size of the community on our own resources, kind of.
I think it relates a lot to maintenance and the dissemination and sort of what is the model that we talked about this a little bit this morning. You know, wikis versus webs. You know, just all of the options that we have, which do have do sort of lend themselves to cheaper maintenance and more proactive maintenance. I think that's really something that we don't want to lose track of, because that providing that ongoing maintenance is an opportunity to get that grassroots kind of ground level support and uptake. If people have a sense that that it's easier and it's clear how to contribute suggestions and how those suggestions are dealt with by CCAD and how they're then disseminated or not. I think you're right. I mean, there's going to be an upfront cost to the initial revision, which will be expensive, presumably. But then the ongoing maintenance is kind of a separate issue that needs to be discussed in relation to like what systems we use and where is that hosted and whatnot.
Just to add to that, this might be a place where the Canadian Archival Network can actually help us in terms of the maintenance stuff. Like if the maintenance activity involves a donation of time on behalf of the archives advisors to help, you know, manage change requests that are coming in for maintaining stuff over time. You know, donating some time to maintenance activities is a lot more realistic within the existing funding structures than donating money. So the maintenance problem doesn't look as insurmountable as the initial costs with a larger revision.
Now, the initial development was done in a working group model. Does the CCAD have a plan with respect to how it would manage the development of the new standard in terms of would it use a working group model, or would CCAD manage that directly?
There's no plan. I mean, in part, I think it's because it was really quite up in the air about what we're doing with the standard. So this was kind of preliminary thinking about what are the issues, what are the options, and if we could come up with some decisions, then we could sort of start that kind of planning and what the resources would be required. But at this point, no.
I also, I guess, coming back to the question of maintenance and the question of the relationship between whatever this national descriptive standard is going to be and ISAD, for example. I mean, we should be thinking about maintenance all the way through, right? So if we want to have a very distinctive Canadian flavor of ISAD, or we want to have our own independent national standard, I mean, this is kind of where the rubber hits the road. It's this ongoing process, and it doesn't go away. I mean, that's why we're at this situation that we're at with RAD right now. So, you know, we shouldn't think of the two problems as being completely decoupled. That, you know, if we want to do this distinctive Canadian thing with our national standard, then we also need to have some kind of a way to support the, you know, bilingual standard is obviously essential, and the ability to do maintenance is essential as well. So.
I guess the level of maintenance is also going to come down to what kind of complexity is built into a new standard. So with the current version of RAD, there's a lot of detailed rules and everything else. It hasn't really been settled whether that's going to change, whether it's going to be more high level. But it could be that a more lightweight standard is a little less overwhelming in terms of ongoing maintenance and in terms of some sort of release cycle. I guess I gather that EAD has now changed its approach. Before it was kind of grant funded when they're doing a new version, and I guess the approach we've taken here is we wait until there's a major revision needed. But I guess, and similar to what you were saying about volunteer time, it would be worth sort of fleshing out what an ongoing maintenance program might look like. Is it the secretariat support basically in terms of meetings? What's the more general role of CCAD is another question to look at. But certainly the upfront cost may be a little more worrying than ongoing.
I think just to add to that, other than volunteer time, there are other non-cash contributions that could be made from either institutions or individuals. I'm thinking in particular about things like web hosting and systems support. It would be very easy, I would imagine, to find, I tend to think of university archives in this way, but some place that can host, a repository or a document home or something to enable this to work. And it becomes part of the IT office's sort of ongoing support to the work of the academic library. I know that my institution does that with other groups. Something like a wiki does not need to be expensive, and it doesn't really need to be a cash cost of the CCA to enable this to work. I think those would be other things to look at.
And also, if we are looking at doing something like a standard and then an implementation guide, the standard would be much, much smaller than what RAD is now, I would think. But then the implementation guide could be kind of crowdsourced. That could be the one that's kind of crowdsourced. So that, I don't know if that would add more administrative issues at the end, but that could be a way of getting people to volunteer examples or how to do this and that to try to use the collective.
I wonder as well whether we could maybe look at some standards that are being successfully, maintained, like DAX or MODS or METS or Premise, and reach out to those organizations that are looking after the maintenance and just getting an idea of, what is it costing them, how are they doing it, and so on.
And have we really abandoned relying on the benevolence of our major institutions to manage these projects? I mean, I'm sure that DAX must be funded in some reasonably large part by NARA, I would suspect. And we should be able to rely on some of our larger institutions or through the Association of Provincial and Territorial Archivists as well, through some of the provincial archives as well.
I believe that METS, MODS, Premise are all maintained by Library of Congress, for example. They're the ones who are underwriting the cost of that for the benefit of the community. It's a great model if you can get it.
What about a more general question about the relationship between CCAD and, say, the provincial territorial councils in terms of possibly cycling more people through, other ways to do that? Like, would it be a good idea, for example, if all the councils had a standards committee themselves and that they kind of sat in on CCAD, so just to get more bodies kind of in the those kind of positions? Because I think that the councils have more sort of sense of what's going on locally and probably can draw on more people, whereas it can become kind of more arbitrary, I think, at the higher level if it's just a smaller group.
As someone here from a council, I'd say that's a very good idea. I think we would be in full support of being part of it.
Heather and I were talking before about telling rad war stories, so I have to add another one. Early on, one of my roles was actually to at least reach out to the council reps to get a sense of what's happening on the ground, what are the issues with rad implementation, and this was still kind of early after the publication, I guess. But so I think that makes a lot of sense. But certainly to keep a communication with those who are talking to users and the smaller institutions.
Yeah, and Christina mentioned earlier about people not adopting it, like that concern. At the Archive Society, people have to follow RAD or some sort of descriptive standard in order to be our members, so that's a good way to make sure people are adopting to it. So yeah.
I think also, it's sort of, we're kind of dancing around a little bit around this, but it's also, we do need to call on LAC to help, that's part of their mandate, to support the development of the profession and to, it's provide professional, technical, and financial support to those involved in the preservation and promotion of the documentary heritage and in providing access to it. So I know nobody wants to really call them out right now, but it's, I think there should be some responsibility, not you, but, at the institutional level, with the understanding that it's not an institutional, that the institution isn't owning the standard, but they should have a major role in supporting the rollout and continuing maintenance of it.
I just want to be a devil's advocate just for a second. And implementing a brand new standard or a revised standard is expensive for institutions. It's expensive to commit staff time for training, for any retooling or rebuilding your systems that need to involve. So there is a significant investment from the institution's point of view. And I'm not talking about this one, just any institution. And so $100 for a print copy of a standard is really negligible in comparison to the real costs an institution faces. So I mean, I'm just saying maybe it should be a costed thing, and I'm wondering, do the people who fund your institutions place a higher value on something that comes free off the internet or something that might cost a couple of $100 that represents a deliberate investment? I don't know who or what people think.
I know at my institution, salary is a completely different beast than operating costs. So the investment of time and training and so forth, that's just an expectation. That's why people are on salary, but operating and salary costs are difficult to cut and control. Presume most people here are either in a unionized environment or affiliated or involved somehow, and so that's not something that can be controlled. Operating budgets, on the other hand, are being cut at probably all of our institutions right now. So, yeah, $100 might be negligible. It seems like there's always a new association for an institution to join and become a part of, and some places can do that, but there aren't that many institutions in Canada. And even if you got $100 out of all of them, what is that going to give us? A few $10,000? I don't know. I mean, $80,000?
This being said, it still remains the case if I can channel the Lone Ranger in some small forgotten town in Ontario. In my experience in teaching RAD in Ontario and across the country, institutions, even if they have volunteer archivists, are still willing to invest in the training and formation of staff. And that still remains the case, and I suspect that is still the case across the country. And so from the training perspective, I think that many institutions would be willing to foot the bill for their staff, volunteer or otherwise, to learn the new standard once it's developed. I don't think that's a concern.
So one question I have is, could you charge for the training and not for the standard? Because for me, working in very different archives, nobody would have paid for the standard, but for the training they might have paid for. That might be one way of doing it, and on a sliding scale too. So if you can do it in terms of like what ACA does in terms of membership, like you have to earn so much, you pay this much. Maybe we could do a sliding scale that way. So a small place in, northern New Brunswick pays, that it's a one person, place pays one thing, where somebody in a national institution pays another.
That's the open source model where the software is free and the training and support is not so much.
Although there is danger in that sometimes archive space is a good example. So I wouldn't necessarily want to go that route, but because there can be a danger of then people going, well, I don't want to pay for it, and then I'm not going to go to it. So we have to be careful.
Well, I mean, training tends to be distributed anyway. That's a big role of the provincial councils. Although I was thinking, I mean, free for the basic PDF, a license fee for the better online version. I mean, there's different models you can look at in that sense. The other question would be, if it's a charge, is it a license to use it every year, or is it you're a one-time hit and then I've got it?
Can I just ask for clarity? Are we still playing devil's advocate, or are we actually considering, no, I'm sorry, I'm saying no. We have to be, it has to be as free as possible, and we have to make it as easy as possible to take it on. I think, I'm just worried that we're maybe going down to a level where we'll regret thinking in these ways. I would hope we would rather put our efforts into making it as easy as possible for the Lone Ranger to get on board and give them as many opportunities to meet colleagues in person, because that's where you accept standards, and that's where you build community, is when you can go to a free workshop, or you can go to a workshop where there's travel funding and where there's going to be a range of people, or where it may be the only time you see another colleague for 6 months. That's just I really need to push that message. Like, it has to be free, and we have to find a way of paying for it. And I agree, we have to ask LEC to step up, because we can all agree at this table that, yes, we should all be doing things in our own little way, but it's really hard to get local buy-in if LAC is kind of wishy-washy.
I would think you also need to include the provincial archives as well. Yeah.
Does this touch into the whole business about the Canadian archival system and that blueprint, and where are we going with that? Because I would think having some kind of addressing the funding issue is kind of critical if we're putting standards as one of the main goals of that. Like, it does cost. So, but I agree. Like, I don't think it would be sustainable if we're trying to fund it from the ground up in one form or another. Like, it's just not going to work. So unless that's addressed somewhere, and the natural place to do it would be in those discussions around what's the Canadian archival system going to look like.
So just to play a different sort of devil's advocate, what about a model sort of like what happens with mods and like, what if LAC was the institutional home for the standard? That is something that has never, I don't think, been discussed in Canada, but it's a model that exists in many other countries. So, just kind of throwing that out there, like, is that, it seems to work well with mods, standards that are maintained at Library of Congress.
How is MARC maintained? CanMARC, was that an LAC home?
Yeah, CanMARC was maintained here, but it was sort of a mirror of US MARC. Now the two, US MARC and CanMARC, have merged MARC 21. The Secretariat is the Library of Congress. They host it, but we translate MARC 21 into French, and we host the French website. There's one person on our team that pretty well manages that's the job, a full-time employee to do the translation and the coding. And there's an international committee that governs MARC, the MARC Advisory Committee. There are members from here, Library of Congress, the British Library, the German National Library, and various associations who all sit on the committee. And every committee member funds their own travel to those meetings in person twice a year. And so that's how the governance works. It's totally volunteer, but Library of Congress does the heavy lifting for maintaining the text of the standard.
Do you want to speak about RDA?
Yeah, I could tell you about RDA, the Resource Description and Access, which is the content standard used in the library community. That's a subscription-based online product, and so each institution or user pays their annual fee, and the co-owners who actually receive the revenue are the three publishing bodies: the American Library Association, Canadian Library Association, and the CILIP in the UK. And the funding supports the Joint Steering Committee. It's now the RDA Steering Committee, and they meet once a year in person. So the funding supports their work, and then the governing board, which is a separate level. There's three groups involved in governing RDA: the publishers, the governing board, and then the people who work on the content. And so, that's 15 people who meet occasionally or twice a year.
It does seem to me like there are much better established and consistent funding streams available to libraries that make paying for a subscription model possible, but I would worry that a subscription model for the archival standard would mean that the Archives, Museum, and Historical Society of Lake Batoche will never ever become standards compliant because they have no resources and they rely on, community elder volunteers. And I would hate to see that go that way. In terms of the idea of LAC hosting the standard, I think it's interesting and worth considering potentially, but again, one of the differences that I see is that the funding that LOC receives in the state seems much larger and much more consistent and impermeable to political change there, whereas it seems like LAC and then LAC's ability to fund the archival system in Canada has been much more subject to changes at the federal political level. And if we were investing the home of the standard there and then saw that political sort of will change and therefore the funding to maintain it, then I would worry that we would be at risk of losing that. So we would, I think, want to consider contingency plans at the very least if we were considering that option.
That's also linking the standard and that to the wider archival community. There's a huge need for advocacy to the government, right, for better support of LAC and the archival system.
I think it would make it harder to justify future cut. You know, I mean, it provides a different sort of level of importance for the national institution. I think that it would be one way for them to fulfill the federal mandate. I mean, you know, I totally understand though your comments, and funding is at that level is always subject to change. However, I think we're all here because the standard that we're talking about is maintained by a nonprofit society that is also subject to the same problems. So, you know, I don't know. I don't have a good answer. RDA is interesting, but again, I mean, you have the American library community is massive, and we're talking about the Canadian archival system here as the user group, which is 800, give or take, whatever you want, whatever number you want to use, is significantly smaller and less resourced at an individual level. So I don't think a subscription model is really going to work for that reason. It won't inject the right amount of money unless you're charging thousands of dollars, which won't work. Somehow the money has to come from the top, somewhere. I mean,
I would also add that any governance model has to include the broader archival profession as well, ACU and ACA as well. So if the standard was hosted at LAC, it would need to have a clear model where those professional associations could speak to the uniquely Canadian experience of involving the profession.
I thought that Bill's comments about RDA were interesting, particularly breaking apart what we're talking about to, you know, he talked about content, publishing, and secretariat, I believe. And I think that's a useful way of thinking about it, and maybe thinking about those different components differently. So, you know, I think we could imagine managing the content is probably the easiest part of that. Managing the publishing, and also given the fact that in the Canadian context it's going to be bilingual, so there's going to be translation and you know, multiple access mechanisms, is going to be more challenging. And I think the point about the limited archival user base is also very relevant. I mean, even if everyone did sign up to pay for it, it's still not going to be enough probably to even cover the cost of publishing, never mind any of the other aspects of it. And then the secretariat function, again, if we want to make updating it, you know, a regular activity as opposed to once every 5 years or 10 years or something like that, then there needs to be an ongoing secretariat. And maybe we can start to think in terms of those different roles. So if, you know, we say sort of coordinating the content side of it is a good role for CCA, for example. You know, who could we look to for publishing? Who could we look to as for secretariat? It seems that LAC would be a good candidate to be the secretariat for the standard. And I don't know, maybe we can think about the publishing role.
I'll go ahead.
I was just going to add, I know I've had a lot to say about this particular topic, but that model of RDA is also a model that I think we're starting to see with open source applications, particularly DSpace, Archive Space. They have multiple governance bodies that work together, and you can find information about how they work and how to participate. And DSpace in particular has a nice kind of graphic that shows how there's a governance body, and then there's implementers, and there's different ways for different institutions and individuals to contribute, but they are teased apart. This issue of governance or the secretariat is something separate. I think there's even an executive committee, and it's and I know it's not the same as a standard, but it's I think that model allows the software to continue to be open source, which is the same thing as making a standard free, in my thinking at least.
Just to add to that comment, we have a great example with Artifactual, and we also have a great example for Islandora, which is based out of PEI, of an open source community that has built like a really solid foundation that will exist separate from the commercial aspects of the software, and maintain the code and maintain that iterative process where they're updating on a regular basis.
So Artifactual could host it, and if you want to make a revision, you need a contract with them, find sponsorship.
Yeah, they're actually separate, different models.
Yeah,
Islandora.
I was thinking
Yeah.
Islandora, and then I was like, okay.
Yeah, no, it's just to clarify, it is different. But the point is, yes, there is a community of people who are interested and willing to work with the model.
Okay, so well, basically, I think this session related to two major topics. One was creating the standard, and the other, and I think most of the discussions went around the maintenance or a maintenance program for the standard that will be created. Although I'm surprised that not that much attention was given to, the nitty-gritty details of who is going to actually work in front of a computer writing and doing the actual writing for the standard. I assume it will be members of CCAD. I don't know exactly how many members CCAD has now in term, apart from the you guys. I mean, the members, how many are there? Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Oh, sorry. There are 5 members. CCA's bylaws guide the membership of every committee,
Mm-hmm.
which states professional associations each have a member. Who else? Sorry, I'm drawing a blank on the other rules. Yes, there's each of the professional associations have a member on each of the CCA committees,
Mm-hmm.
and pardon me, and LAC as well.
Okay. But I just wanted to mention that at some point there's going to be a lot of, down-to-earth work to be done in terms of writing the actual standard.
Sorry, related to that though, maybe Chris, you could say more about what's being contracted at this stage. Is it the consultation about the next steps, or?
So what's happening within the contract that we have right now? It is the discussion about the future of the standard. So this consultation and the report that will make recommendations about where we go from here, which could lead itself to another proposal as well.
And more money. Why not? Okay, so the main points. Well, first, I think everybody was seeing CCA and CCAD. Was seeing them remaining in charge of the standard. The costs. I think most people mentioned that it should remain a free resource. But that there would be costs related to translation, maintenance, meetings, implementation. That some of those costs could be splitted, or at least we could ask for contributions from various stakeholders, such as ACA, AAQ, and others. Let me see. Maintenance. Yeah, maintenance was discussed a lot. Also, the importance of having the standard easily accessible for educational purposes in universities and teaching the new version of RAD. Let me try to understand what I wrote here. Okay, and that the fact that at the stage where we're at, there's no real model existing yet to draft a new standard. That remains to be seen. And that, again, linking to the maintenance issue, that the level of maintenance would correspond a lot to the complexity of the standard we would create. Crowdsourcing was discussed. Having people help us with some part of the process for the standard. Also to see what other institutions, other associations in other countries, what they are doing in terms of working on their standards and maintaining them. So maybe try to see what's working with some of our colleagues elsewhere. And again, that major players should be involved and be part of the support for our current project like LAC or the provincial archives. And well, we finish by talking about other governance models. RDA was mentioned in terms of things we could learn from them in terms of governance of our standard. Anything from our students back there? No, not yet? Okay. Consultation. Oh, sorry.
Yeah, I'm just waiting. Is this on? Yes. This might be as good a point at any to mention this, but something that was crossing my mind that I think is important is to make sure that the current RAD, the old version of RAD, remains accessible somewhere. I've been doing some research this semester looking into the RAD revision process, and it's either difficult or impossible to find, say, RAD 2 or the earlier versions of RAD. And so I think from a research standpoint, it'll be useful to keep that accessible, and I think also for those who do find details within RAD useful, I think it'd be good for them to still be able to pick and choose to the bits that they find useful and sort of use old RAD sort of like another standard in a suite of standards as people do currently. So that's just a point I wanted to make.
Okay, thank you.
Sorry, I had one more question.
Sure.
Sorry. I was just curious if it does go subscription-based or on some sort of paywall, who is going to be responsible for enforcing that is paid, and how are they going to do so? Like, what is to stop institution X from giving institution Y, here's my digital copy of it? Is it just going to be by borrowing them from CCA support or some other means like that? Like, how do you enforce that?
We used to joke about the RAD police, but that was about punctuation.
I don't anticipate the formation of a archival standards black market. But certainly with respect to current watermarking techniques that are used with existing distribution of materials, I suspect that watermarking could be used if we decided to go with a pay model. But I don't think the consensus around the table is that individual archivists would have to pay at all, that there would be a focus on institutions and other stakeholders that might foot the majority of the bill for creating and maintaining the standard.
Okay, thank you. And in terms of giving access to previous versions of RAD and documentation, which should be available easily on, let's say, CCA's page, I think the same goes with most of the documentation that goes with all the proceedings here and various working documents and stuff. I guess that's also something we want to do to keep it as transparent as possible. Okay.